Hola Spanish pros! Today I have an amazing video for you to improve your conversational Spanish vocabulary, something essential to understand those weird phrases that we, native speakers, use in our daily life.
Hola amigos! My name is Julio Foppoli and I want you to speak Spanish like a pro.
Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and post any comments or suggestions below. I read all of them, and I'd love to know what you think. And it will give me real feedback to know if you would like me to do more activities like this one. Oh, and don't forget to visit my website, www.spanishlikeapro.com. On my website, you will find tons of listening comprehension training to enable you to understand that supersonic speed Spanish that native speakers use all the time. Now, in our previous story, I showed you the story in Spanish, and you had to come up with the phrases to understand what it was going on in English. Now, today we're going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to show you the English, and we'll have to get to the Spanish. But sometimes it's not possible to translate everything perfectly word for word, and an alternative strategy is actually to translate the ideas. And in the process, we're going to also learn some amazing phrases. A little bit of context, if you remember the first part, this kid had problems, with this diary. He doesn't want to write on a diary. He wants to justify that he's having a diary. Probably he doesn't feel that's manly enough for a boy to have a diary. So basically, he's trying to justify it one way or another. And well, this continues that idea. And he says, the only reason I agree to do this at all is because I figure later on, when I'm rich and famous, I'll have better things to do than answer people's stupid questions all day long. So this book is going to come in handy. Think of how you would say this in Spanish. You feel free to pause the video if you need a moment to think about this. I'll count up to 5 and then we'll continue with this analysis. I have a couple of phrases here that I find very interesting to know that probably can help you a lot. Do you know how you would say this? How would you say this? The only reason. Reason, if we know, is razón, right? So I could say something like la única razón. Another word for reason could be motivo. So I could say el único motivo. These are valid translations for this. But notice this phrase. The only reason I agreed. For example, you may know that to agree is aceptar. This is one possible translation. Remember, we are going to do I'm going with you over the more literal analysis, and then we're going to compare it to the translation that in many cases may be much better than this word-for-word analysis that usually students do. But to agree is aceptar. So, but if I wanted to say la única razón yo acepté, I agreed, there would be a problem here. In Spanish, we would never say this, or at least we would need something in between. When we're talking about razón, we would say la única razón por la que. Notice that, la razón por la que. I'm going to remove única so that I have more space here. La única razón por la que acepté, or else I'm running out of space. Or if we use the word motivo, I could say el único motivo por el que acepté. So, el motivo por el que, la razón por la que, we could say por la cual also, that's possible. El único motivo por el que o por el cual acepté. La única razón por la que o el motivo por el que o por el cual. The only reason I agreed to do this at all is because I figure later on, when I'm rich and famous, blah, 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 blah. This phrase, I figure, right? This is a great phrase to figure. Remember, this is as a verb. We could have possible translations to this. For this, we could say, we could use the verb parecer. We could use the verb suponer. I think this is a great verb. Okay. And if we have to put this first phrase together, I would say something along the lines of la única razón por la que acepté hacer todo esto es, the only reason I agreed to do all this is, la única razón por la que acepté hacer todo esto es, because I figure later on when I'm rich and famous, porque supongo que later on, this is a great phrase, right? We could have, again, different ways of going about that. A good phrase that students don't usually use is when you say later on is un día. That's a good phrase that we have. There's different ways. Later on, we could say un día, el día de mañana. That's another phrase, not later on in the day. For example, say that I'm talking about, okay, now we're going to do this, and later on we're going to see the answers in Spanish. Well, that later on, if you're talking about the same kind of like close period of time, today, this wouldn't apply. But if I say later on with this idea of eventually, this is un día o el día de mañana. So let's actually see how they translated this first part in Spanish. El único motivo por el que, notice here, we know that to agree is aceptar, right? Coincidir in many cases, right? But notice here, notice this translation, super conversational, super idiomatic, but instead here they use the phrase prestarse a. El único motivo por el que me presto a escribir. That's a great phrase. Prestarse a is to agree to do something. Notice the difference between prestar, to lend, puedes prestarme $10, and prestarse a, to agree to do something. Now, usually with this phrase, I cannot think of I cannot say every single situation because I'm sure that there must be some situation that this is not like this. But for the most part, prestarse a algo, prestarse a hacer algo, usually involves that there's something fishy, something dishonest, something that maybe you shouldn't be doing. So, el único motivo por el que me presto a escribir aquí, notice that it's a little bit different from the version in English. Literally, we're saying the only reason I agreed to write here, see this part, escribir aquí is not in the English version, es porque el día de mañana, because eventually one day later on, cuando sea rico y famoso, when I'm rich and famous, cuando sea rico y famoso, I'll have better things to do than answer people's stupid questions all day long. Well, this part we can show it. Tendré que hacer cosas más importantes que pasarme el día contestando preguntas estúpidas. Notice this, that what's the English for this? Pasarme el día. Well, notice that I'll have better things to do than answer people's stupid questions all day long. So notice that here, all day long, which in Spanish we could say todo el día, here it's expressed a little bit different. Pasarme el día, pasar el día, to spend the day, to spend the day. But it's another great phrase to say all day long, pasarme el día, right? I'll have better things to do. This is kind of like literal. Tendré que hacer cosas más importantes o tendré cosas más importantes que hacer. This is flexible. Que pasarme, that spend all day, contestando preguntas estúpidas. Answering people's stupid questions. Obviously, we could have said las preguntas estúpidas de la gente, okay? That could have been said. Remember, the key in a good translation, or when you use these materials, is not necessarily to have word for word translation, because in many cases, being a different language, sometimes we don't express things exactly the same way, even if we could. So pay attention to how these things are explained here, how they are translated here. Yeah, that's a good way of learning real Spanish. And then it says, so this book is gonna come in handy. This is a great phrase, to come in handy, to be useful, right? So to come in handy, this could be ser útil. We could use also venir bien. That's a good phrase, right? So we could say, así que este libro is gonna come, va a, we could use that kind of future, va a ser útil, va a venir bien. We could put me va a ser útil, me va a venir bien. We can use the other future as well. Me será útil, me vendrá bien. Okay, let's see what the author used here. Así que este libro, they changed it a little bit, podría resultar útil. Literally more like could be useful. And now let's go to the last part. Gregory, tell us about your childhood. Well, if you know that the word childhood is niñez, so could be Gregory's, tell us about your childhood, Gregory. To tell, contar, cuéntanos sobre tu juventud, right? Let's see what they have here. Notice that instead of, bueno, cuéntanos, they went with háblenos. That's good. Háblenos de su niñez. They didn't use niñez, they use juventud. Juventud is more like youth, right? Your younger years, right? Okay, this could work very well here, right? So again, the important thing is not to be too obsessed with, oh, it's not exactly the same word. It's kind of like, you see, expressing the idea, getting close to the idea. It doesn't necessarily need to be 100% accurate. And that's something that you have to consider when you speak in Spanish, because sometimes in English you try to say every little nuance you want to express it. And you see that sometimes even professional translators, like in this case, they don't do that. They just modify what they say in their target language. That's an important strategy to use. Okay. So if you don't know how to express it exactly, okay, just get close. Get close. That's good. Okay, and the next thing that the person asks is, were you always so smart and handsome? Were you always, siempre fuiste? The person could have said, has sido siempre, siempre has sido, right? So it could have been that. Siempre has sido. Have you always been, literally? Or you could also use siempre fuiste. Of course, you could also say fuiste siempre. You can switch the order. So smart and handsome. So smart, tan inteligente y guapo, or you could have y tan guapo. Usually students get confused with tan and tanto. Notice that usually tan is followed by adjective or adverb. Tan bueno, tan bonito. That's tan plus an adjective. Tan caro. Tan rápidamente. So quickly. Tan rápidamente. This is an adverb. Okay. So we use tan is followed by adjectives or adverbs, and we use tanto plus nouns, right? So we say, no sé, I don't know how she has so much money. Tanto dinero, tantos amigos, tantas propiedades. Notice that these are all nouns. And as they are nouns, tanto has to adjust. It has to modify those nouns, right? Tanto dinero. But propiedades is feminine. Tantas propiedades. Masculine and plural. Amigos. Well, tantos amigos, right? So were you always so smart and handsome? Bueno, fue siempre. Remember, they are addressing him as usted. Usted fue siempre tan inteligente y guapo. Tan inteligente y guapo. And then notice that he says, here's my journal. Now, shoo. Now, this shoe, when one says shoe, this is like it could be an interjection, something that we say, interjection, right? So which is fuera, largo. Shoe can also be like a verb, like for example, irse, largarse, right? That's to leave, right? To get lost, to get out. Okay, that's the idea. So we can say, bueno, aquí tiene mi diario. That's a possible translation. Ahora fuera o largo o váyanse o lárguense. Yeah, these are all possibilities, right? So let's see the actual or the translator's choice. Aquí tienen mis memorias, ahora lárguense. Lárguense, ustedes, the command form of largarse. Now, from all this, as I always tell you, less is more. You don't necessarily need to know every single nuance, every single word here. I would say just choose 4 or 5 phrases that you think you can use straight away. And by doing that, you will be laser focused on these phrases, and you can always use them. Try to use them in your next conversation. I have some specific activities for these kinds of situation, for this kind of vocabulary analysis on my website, SpanishLikeAPro.com, in which we create some charts for you to be able to use this vocabulary in context. Now that we have them side by side, take a moment to analyze the Spanish, the English, pause the video if you need. And finally, I'm going to tell you my vocabulary selection. The first one I would choose is el único motivo por el que. I would extend it here. El motivo por el que, el motivo por el cual. That's a great phrase. Another good phrase is prestarse a, to agree to do something. Remember that prestarse a has this idea of dishonesty behind it. I won't accept to do that in this company. No voy a prestarme a hacer eso. No voy a prestarme a hacer eso. Another phrase, and this I think that probably the best so far, the best of these 3, el día de mañana. That's something that you can use like right now. Now, another amazing phrase, el día de mañana. El día de mañana. Remember, this is more like, the meaning is more like eventually, later on, one day. Then, remember this grammar item, cuando, when it refers to a future event, triggers subjunctive, cuando sea rico y famoso. Then we have, así que este libro podría resultar útil. To come in handy, resultar útil. So this would be my vocabulary selection. We can also mention something that I don't want to forget. Tan, remember what we said earlier, tan plus adjective, tanto plus nouns, tan plus adjective or adverbs, tan bueno, tan rápido, tan inteligente, tan guapo. And we have tanto plus a noun, tantas personas, right? Now, notice something that I don't think I mentioned before. Notice that he's saying here, here's my journal. Here's my journal. Or I could also say, how much is this? $5. Okay, here you are. In this case, notice that we don't use the verb to be. We don't use ser. We don't use estar. Notice that we use the verb tener. Here's my journal. Aquí tiene mi diario. We could say aquí tiene mi diario. O aquí tienen mi diario. But we use the verb tener. If I say here you are, aquí tienes. O aquí tiene. O aquí tienen. Someone from Spain, you're talking to a group. Aquí tenéis. Right? So the verb we use is tener. Aquí tienen mis memorias. Ahora, shoo, lárguense. Okay? So you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, personally, if I was studying this, I would even simplify this and I would stick to 4 or 5 phrases. So my selection within the selection, I would say, el único motivo por el que, el día de mañana, cuando sea rico y famoso, resultar útil, and I would say, aquí tienen. Those 5. But this is not over yet. After all of this hard work that we did, Now it's time to listen to the story without my interruptions there.
El único motivo por el que me presto a escribir aquí es porque el día de mañana, cuando sea rico y famoso, tendré que hacer cosas más importantes que pasarme el día contestando preguntas estúpidas. Así que este libro podría resultar útil. Gregory, háblenos de su juventud. ¿Fue siempre tan inteligente y guapo? Aquí tienen mis memorias, ahora lárguense. El único motivo por el que me presto a escribir aquí es porque el día de mañana, cuando sea rico y famoso, tendré que hacer cosas más importantes que pasarme el día contestando preguntas estúpidas. Así que este libro podría resultar útil. Gregory, háblenos de su juventud. ¿Fue siempre tan inteligente y guapo? Aquí tienen mis memorias, ahora lárguense. El único motivo por el que me presto a escribir aquí es porque el día de mañana, cuando sea rico y famoso, tendré que hacer cosas más importantes que pasarme el día contestando preguntas estúpidas. Así que este libro podría resultar útil. Gregory, háblenos de su juventud. ¿Fue siempre tan inteligente y guapo? Aquí tienen mis memorias, ahora lárguense.
Amigos, esto es todo por hoy. As a great follow-up activity, study the vocabulary and then listen to this part that we analyzed today many times. That will consolidate your vocabulary and you will feel that whenever you need to speak, the words will just come to you. Do this first with the text, as you see here, and then hide the text and just listen to that part over and over again, and always try to use this in your next conversation. Remember, language is like this. Use it or lose it. I would like to know what you think about these activities. Would you like me to do some more like this, or would you like me to do something different? Please let me know in the comment section below. And I have another question for you. What's your favorite phrase that we learned today? Even better, if you want to go for the gold, try to write a little sentence with a little bit of context in which you would use this phrase. I promise I will read all of your comments. Bueno, amigos, esto es todo por hoy. Mi nombre es Julio Foppoli, and I want you to speak Spanish like a pro. Nos vemos pronto. Chao, chao.